Hey everyone, my name is Nasia Safdar. I'm the faculty director for this Clinical Trials Community of Practice series. Today, we're delighted to welcome Jake Rome. Jake is the director of the FDA Regulated Research Oversight Program, has a wealth of expertise with anything that you can imagine related to FDA regulated research. And today he will be talking to us about research with drugs and devices, basic requirements for FDA compliance. Thank you so much, Jake. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Nazia. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into it because this is a topic I could spend a lot of time talking about. I have about 40 to 45 minutes here, and I think I could take most of these slides and spend a day talking about most of them. So we're going to go through this really quickly. I just want to note if you have any questions, there'll be a time at the end, hopefully to answer some questions, and feel free to reach out to me outside of the presentation to talk through any issues or questions that you have. So really, what I'm hoping to focus on today and what I want you to walk out of today with is the ability to identify the scope of FDA's oversight of drugs and devices, to apply the FDA's regulatory framework to research with drugs or devices that you may be doing, and then also to understand basic sponsor investigator responsibilities for FDA regulated research. And again, going to happen very quickly, as I mentioned. So in terms of scope of FDA oversight, I want to start out by saying the FDA regulates a lot of things: foods, drugs, devices, supplements, animal products, and they do it in a lot of different ways in research and manufacturing, marketing, post-approval. So the focus of this presentation is really on the regulations that apply to the use of drugs and devices in research. So I've highlighted those. This is sort of a selection of 21 CFR requirements. But it's important to note that even though we're going to talk about the regulations they apply to research, often the regulations are applying before you get to the point of conducting a clinical study. So for example, good laboratory practices may apply if you're doing bench testing for drugs. Good manufacturing practice will apply if you're both doing drug development or device development, although in device development, they would call it quality systems regulations and quality controls. So I'll sprinkle a little bit of those requirements throughout this presentation, but I just want to note that even if we're talking about devices and drugs and research, everything that the FDA is regulating is happening often before you get to the point of using a device in clinical research. The other thing that I mentioned previously is that I could probably spend an hour touching on each of these topics, if not more. And if I want to leave time for questions, I get about a minute per slide. As you'll see here, Eli Lilly has their own formal boot camp that they're doing. They are going to give you a week to help you understand what it takes to develop and implement a drug in a clinical trial and through marketing. So again, this is all going to be very high level. We're sort of looking at the forest at this point in time. But I will note this boot camp is upcoming. So if this is something that you're interested in, if you're a KL2 or K12 scholar or early career scientist, reach out to Bernadette Gillick or Peggy Hatfield in ICTR for assistance in applying for this boot camp opportunity. But again, these are very complicated things, and you can spend weeks learning it. In this case, weeks, along with 4 to 6 months of virtual sessions to really lock it in. So high-level overview in this case. The other thing that I want to highlight at the very beginning of this presentation is that the FDA's focus is not just on marketing activities, and that is a question that I get a lot. Someone will say, oh, well, this isn't FDA regulated because I have no intent to market this product in the future. The FDA's scope is well beyond that. They are focused on protecting the rights, safety, and welfare of subjects. So just because something is going to be used for research purposes only, and they'll never result in a marketing application, it doesn't mean that it's not subject to FDA regulations. What's going to really, and we'll talk about this in detail, factor into whether or not something that you're doing has FDA oversight of it is going to be whether it meets the definition of a clinical investigation, which I will spend a handful of slides talking through, as there are very specific definitions of those based on whether or not you're working with drugs or devices. So the first thing that we need to do is define a drug and a biologic. So what is a drug? As outlined here, drugs are substances either recognized by the pharmacopoeia or formularies But in general, they're a substance that intended for the use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or it's a substance that's intended to affect the structure or function of the body. And really, when we think about drugs, we're thinking about chemical entities. A biologic, on the other hand, is also something that's intended for the use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, or affects the structure or function of the body, but it has more of an organic component to it. It's not sort of as simple as the chemical entities that make up drugs. Now, it's an important distinction for lots of reasons, but when it comes to use of these in research, it's actually pretty straightforward because they both qualify under IND requirements. So they are regulated very similarly by the FDA. The big distinction would be, if you're using a drug and you have to provide chemical manufacturer, sorry, if you're using a biologic and you have to submit chemical manufacturing control information, you're going to have a lot more to address in terms of things like potency and quality if you have a biologic, because there can be other things that get in there. They're not necessarily as clean. And I also will highlight that it's important to keep the substance component of this in mind. So a drug does not need to have a health component to be a drug. It can affect structure function. So delta-9 THC would be an example of that. You can do a study with delta-9 to see how it might assess a health effect, and that is going to be FDA regulated. But you could also look and give delta-9 to a participant and say, how does this impact your driving? That also falls within the FDA purview. So it's not just health related. And the last thing I'll note is that there are other things that the FDA regulates, like human cells, tissues, and blood products. We're not going to go over that. If you have questions about those, reach out to me, because those get really into the weeds, and I don't have time to talk about everything I want to talk about today, so we're going to have to skip a few things. And then the other caveat I'll throw in here is dietary supplements and food. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you go to the grocery store or Walgreens to pick up a dietary supplement, the FDA regulates that in a very particular way. When you're using dietary supplements in research, the FDA is really looking at whether or not you're using it as a dietary supplement or you're using it as a drug. So I'll get into this in a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight that dietary supplements and food can sometimes be considered drugs for research purposes, even if they, in general, are commercially available in your pharmacy or at your grocery store. So just something to keep in mind if you're doing with that. And we have a large cranberry association here in Wisconsin, so even things like that can start to tiptoe the line between FDA regulated as a drug versus FDA regulated as a food. All right, so that was the easy part. Defining a drug and defining a biologic is pretty easy. Defining a medical device is a little more complicated. So what is a medical device? In short, it's anything that's not a drug or biologic. And so anything intended for the use in the diagnosis of disease or condition, or that affects the structure or function of the body and doesn't do it through chemical or biological means. It makes it a drug. I think the best way to highlight this for everyone is that if a popsicle stick, when it's called a tongue depressor, can be a medical device, anything can be a medical device. And so basically, again, if it's not a drug and it's not a biologic, but it's health related, you really want to evaluate whether or not it might be considered a medical device. So we have these things, I call them traditional medical devices that we think of: imaging machines, fusion pumps, monitors, even syringes, bandages. Those are all classified as medical devices. Some of them would be class 3 that require full FDA approval to market. Some of them you can just say, hey, I'm going to make a bandage, FDA, and go ahead and do that. But then we also have this category of what I'll call non-traditional medical devices. These are things that are becoming more popular in certain instances, but it's things like in vitro diagnostic products. So tests, assays that we're doing, the drug tests that you're picking up at Walgreens, or COVID tests that we're all very familiar with. Software, wellness software, heart rate monitors, those can be medical devices as well, as can diagnostic imaging machine software, and even sort of interesting things like mouthwashes. If a mouthwash uses physical instead of chemical means to perform its action, it can be classified as a device and not a drug. And you'll see companies will go to bat to try and force the FDA to classify their products as devices and not drugs, because it is much easier to bring a device product to market than it is a drug product. So if you pay attention to the news, you'll see, may have seen some of that in the last couple of years with some like barium agents that you swallow as part of swallow tests. So just something to keep in mind. Again, devices can be anything. And in particular, because this is a very popular topic right now, I just want to highlight software as a medical device. So what is software as a medical device? It is software that's intended for one or more medical uses that's run on different operating systems or in virtual environments. Basically, anything that's run on a computer or a phone or a mobile platform can be software as a medical device. That's different than software in a medical device. So when we think of that, it's like MRI software that's embedded within the MRI machine to make the MRI machine function. That is software in a medical device that is regulated as part of the overall product. Software as a medical device is regulated separately as an independent product. Although that can be tricky as well, because if you have a glucose monitor with a phone app, well, if that glucose monitor is run by it was overseen by a large device company, then they may consider it a package of one device, and that would be software in a medical device. If you are working at the UW and you've created a software product to work with a glucose monitor, then what you've developed is probably software as a medical device, because it's an independent component of that other device that you're being implemented. So it can be really tricky to sort this out as well. But again, if you're developing your own software, more likely than not, you're looking at something that's potentially software as a medical device. Now, I could spend a day talking about software as a medical device and what is and isn't considered software as a medical device by the FDA. And I just don't have time to do that today. So you will get a copy of the slide. I have embedded a bunch of resources in here to help you understand and navigate that. I'm also willing to talk to you about what those requirements are. But I just want to highlight the FDA has this digital health policy navigator, which walks you through what types of software as a medical device the FDA regulates. Now, one note about using the digital health policy navigator is you will see this fun prompt that says that may say, your device is subject to FDA enforcement discretion. I just want to put the caveat out there that the FDA's exercise of enforcement discretion is limited to marketing purposes. If you are using a device in research and it classifies as a clinical investigation of a device, then you are responsible for jumping through all the FDA's IDE hoops as needed, and as we'll discuss in a little bit. So that enforcement discretion doesn't get you out of everything, particularly in the research context. It just means you don't necessarily have to submit something to the FDA before you can market it officially as a product. It's sort of silly that they do it that way, but that's just the reality of software as a medical device as it is. And then I'll also note that, AI machine learning, that's been big in the last couple of years, very much can be software as a medical device and regulated by the FDA, as are things like augmented reality, virtual reality devices. Again, sort of anything health related can be, a medical device, including software. And that brings me up to another sort of big category of software as a medical device that I get a lot of questions about, and that's clinical decision support software. It's becoming very popular. It's often AI enhanced or AI backed. It can do things like flag patients with a potential condition, provide risk scores. You can also do things like provide inputs to patients to help them in decision making. Don't have time to go over this in detail, but there is a lot of good FDA guidance out there, again, linked in the slides. But just a few notes, keep in mind that if you're analyzing images or signals, you're not going to qualify as what the FDA calls non-device CDS. It is going to be a medical device in the FDA's eyes. And also, if you're patient facing, if the device influences how a patient acts, then you're also not going to qualify as non-device CDS. That is something that the FDA is focused on in terms of regulating medical devices and software as a medical device. So just as a quick overview here, or as a quick example, like, is this a traditional or a non-traditional device? This is a powered wheelchair. As you can see, I pulled the information from the FDA's device classification. This is in fact a regulated medical device that they don't use GMP to manufacture, but it is subject to certain FDA regulations. They have established the manufacturer, as you can see in Marshall, Minnesota there, as someone that is manufacturing and marketing devices. So popsicle stick, a super wheelchair, all things that are considered medical devices by the FDA. So something to consider when you're deciding, am I working with a medical device? Is what I'm developing a medical device? All right, so now we know what a drug and a device is, or sort of. Now, how do we apply FDA regulations to those? So starting with the easy regulations first, we'll talk about drugs and devices. So again, as I mentioned before, we're focused on using drugs and devices in clinical investigations, but as a note, there are requirements for both before putting a drug or device into a participant and in terms of marketing after you've done your research. So just keep in mind that FDA, when we say FDA regulated, it can mean any number of things. So as an example for drugs, if you're developing a new drug or a new biologic, you should be thinking about current good manufacturing practices. Now, they may not apply up front because you're going to handle a lot of that through your IND application. But when you think about things like scaling in the future, that's something that you're going to have to be focused on GMP for. You know, how do you make this product in higher quantities, maintaining the quality that you need to establish in order for the FDA to approve it. So again, even if it's not 312, which is going to be the focus of the discussion now, you're going to want to pay attention to those requirements as well. And this is sort of the key part that I want to focus on for clinical, for the drugs and devices used in research generally. It is always going to hinge on what the definition of clinical investigation is. And there are multiple definitions of clinical investigations. There is a specific definitions under parts 50 and 56, which apply to consent and IRB requirements. And then there are separate definitions for both part 312 for drugs and biologics and part 812 for devices. So it is going to be very specific to what is happening in your protocol. And in general, for parts 50 and 56, it's an unapproved use of a drug, biologic, or medical device, or a test article where the study data will be submitted to the FDA when it's administered to or used on a human subject. So again, if you're using a device or a drug, then it may be subject to 50 or 56. Even if it wasn't subject to 50 or 56 necessarily, but you intend to submit the information to the FDA to support an application, you would be subject to 50, 56 as well. An example and sort of an analogy to that would be drug studies that are conducted outside of the United States. If you want to do a drug study outside the United States, but it's submitted in the US for purposes of marketing here, you need to follow the US's rules on how you conduct the clinical trial in order for the FDA to accept that data. That's sort of where this derives from. As I mentioned, the definition in 312 is different. So the definition of a clinical investigation is a drug or biologic, again, approved or unapproved, administered to or used on one or more human subjects as part of an experiment. And that as part of an experiment is very important for the purposes of this definition. So what is as part of an experiment? It is any use of a drug except for the use of a drug as part of normal clinical practice. So as an example, there are a couple of examples here from the FDA's guidance about what's an experiment. But I think the key thing to remember here is if you're administering a drug and the administration of the drug is dictated by your protocol, your study is going to be subject to 312. And that doesn't mean that you're going to need to submit an IND application necessarily, because if you're using it on label, then you're going to be exempt from that, as we'll discuss in a minute here. But it is important to recognize that if you are administering a drug because of protocol, you are not administering a drug in the scope of medical practice in the eyes of the FDA, and they are going to consider you within their regulatory framework. And so an example of that would be you're doing a clinical study where you're going to randomize subjects to either one type of anesthesia block or another type of anesthesia block. It's all randomized by what happens in the by the protocol. You are therefore administering that drug as part of that protocol, and that study is going to be subject to FDA oversight. So again, you're going to have to look and see, do I need to apply 312? How do I apply 312? So there are sort of, if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to talk through when things may or may not be. Now, there will also be situations like you have the ability to give pain relief to a subject or lidocaine. You're doing a procedure like a lumbar puncture, you need to provide lidocaine for that or some sort of anesthesia to help with that procedure. Again, that's sort of derived from the protocol, but as long as it's within the discretion of the provider to administer whatever dose they determine is necessary, then we wouldn't consider that part of the experiment. That's sort of separate. That's clinical decision making. So those types of uses of drugs fall outside the scope of the FDA's purview. So again, randomization is sort of a key example of when something would bring you into the FDA regulations. That sort of physician discretion about when to administer a drug otherwise is when something would fall outside of the scope of the FDA's purview. So now that we know what a clinical investigation is, how do we apply the drug regulations? I've just thrown this flow chart from Regard, which is out of Duke, UNC, NC State, the Research Triangle. It sort of tries to help academic medical centers understand how to apply these. I definitely recommend going to the website because they have a lot of good resources. But basically, I just want to highlight we're always going to follow the same process. Is it a clinical investigation? Will a drug be used in the study? Is it IND exempt? If not, then we're going to need an IND. Now, again, there are some caveats to that as well. For example, RDRC, the Radioactive Drug Research Committee, is for certain radio tracers is something where you may be able to use that instead of IND submission, but generally we don't see too many of those a year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on any of that. The focus will be, do I need an IND? And I've included the full requirements here in this slide, but I think there are some sort of 3 key criteria that you need to pay attention to if you're doing a clinical investigation with a drug. First, is the drug product legally marketed in the United States? Second, does the investigation not involve a route of administration, dose, patient population, or other factor that significantly increases the risks or decreases the acceptability of the risks associated with the use of the drug? Those are really going to be the criteria that determine whether or not you're going to need to submit an IND to the FDA. Again, as I mentioned before, if you're using a drug on label, more likely than not, you're going to fit these criteria because you're just going to have to get IRB review. You're going to have to make sure you follow through on certain consent requirements. And those are things that, as a result of working for UW-Madison or UW Health, you're already required to do. So it's not a lot of change between what is expected of you otherwise. But one of the, like I said, there are a couple of key criteria. The first one is the product FDA approved? I just wanted to note here, a good place to look for that is the FDA's Orange Book. If it's a drug, the FDA also has the Purple Book, which is if it's a biologic. You can go there and you can identify whether or not a drug product is currently approved. So that's a good place to go if you don't have questions. And it can be a little tricky. So as an example, COVID vaccines that were approved under EUAs were not, even though you could get them, considered legally marketed by the FDA. So any use of those, even if you could get it from the manufacturer directly, required you to submit an IND for that. The other thing to note is that labeling is useful to understand the approved indications and how you might be able to use the drug. That'll factor into my next slide, but I just wanted to note here that the FDA also has an online label repository where you can go to find the most up-to-date versions of the labeling that has been submitted to the FDA to compare your use or your proposed use to what the approved uses are to make some of these determinations. So the primary determinations that you're looking at, again, as I mentioned before, route of administration. Are you changing the route of administration? If so, then you're leaning towards needing an IND. Are you increasing the dose or the frequency? If yes, then you may be significantly increasing the risks and therefore may need an IND. Are you doing it in a different patient population? As an example, if you're doing things with drugs approved for adults in pediatric populations, that is going to be more likely to require an IND. Or if you're doing something for if you're taking a drug that's approved for a cancer population or a cancer indication and using it in a healthy population, you're absolutely going to need to get an IND for that because the risks are significantly different and what's acceptable to the FDA changes. Again, don't have a lot of time to go through all of this, but the FDA has some good guidance on IND exemptions for lawfully marketed cancer drugs, which is also extremely useful for non-cancer drugs. And they actually include the exact statement in the guidance itself. So I'd recommend checking that out if you're working with an agent. If your study is not IND exempt, what does that mean? Well, it means you need to submit an IND. What does that entail? A lot. So not going to go over this all in detail, but really you need to put together an IND packet, which is information about the drug that you submit to the FDA for their review, along with information about who's going to be doing the investigation. You need to include a copy of the protocol. You include chemistry, manufacturing, and control information, particularly if you're going to be either developing the product yourself, manufacturing the product yourself, or in some way changing the product once you receive it. If it's another drug that you're getting from a manufacturer, include information. Typically, you're looking to use the drug in. Now, how complicated an IND is really depends on your subject population, as well as whether or not the product is approved or not. If you have an approved product, then typically using the label is a good way to sort of get through a lot of these requirements. You can often rely on that package insert to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Again, if you're looking to submit an IND, reach out to me. I can help you navigate that process. And then again, a note on dietary supplements. Again, this is where the term clinical investigation becomes important. If you're using a dietary supplement, but it's intended to evaluate, you're looking to evaluate the supplement's ability to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat a disease or condition, you're using that supplement as a drug, not as a supplement, and it's going to fall within the FDA's regulation of drugs. Again, the FDA has some good guidance on there. But some things to consider, if you're targeting a population with a disease to see how the supplement impacts that population, you're not going to qualify as a structure function study. Really, structure function is sort of focused on normal, healthy individuals. And then there's some other carve-outs for if it's a known drug. I think an example here might be vitamin D and scurvy. That might be right. That's another one where we know there's a direct link. So the FDA says that doesn't require an IND anyways. But if you're working with a dietary supplement or food, feel free to reach out. Happy to talk through that. All right. So again, that was the easy part of it. Now we get into the device regulations. And my same caveat from the drug regulations apply here. Really, the FDA's regulations start before you're looking to implement a product in a clinical investigation. So keep in mind things like quality systems regulations, labeling requirements, because they're going to play a major factor into the process for getting an IRB or the FDA to approve your use of a device in a research population. So, as I mentioned at the start here, the FDA has multiple definitions of clinical investigations. The Part 50 and 56 definition stays the same for a device, but the definition of a clinical investigation under 21 CFR 812 is different than the drug regulations. So what is a clinical investigation of a device? It is the use of a medical device, either approved or unapproved, on a human subject, which can include human specimens, whether or not they're identifiable, to evaluate the safety or effectiveness of the device. And so this is two things about this definition that are distinctly different from the drug biologic clinical investigation definition. One, it applies to specimens. And again, the FDA doesn't care if the specimens are identifiable or not. And there also has to be an evaluation of safety or effectiveness of the device, right? With a drug, if you're administering it, you get brought into the FDA's purview. With a device, you have to be looking at you have to be evaluating the safety or effectiveness of the device for the Part 812 requirements to apply. So what does it mean to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of a device? And the reality is it's not defined in Part 12 or any FDA guidance. I think the FDA sort of thinks you know it when you see it. It includes things like clinical safety assessments, as we would expect, but also whether the device performs its intended purpose and how it's used in terms of human factors engineering and operator technique, and things that might go into building out the labeling for it can also be seen as evaluations of safety and effectiveness. And I just want to highlight it is very, very broad. I mean, if any of the aims of your study are related to safety or effectiveness of the device, looking at how it works, how it might be able to influence clinical care in X, Y, or Z way, then more likely than not, device regulations are going to apply. Now, that doesn't mean that all studies that involve a device, a study that involves an MRI machine is going to be FDA regulated and under 812. If you're only using a device as a tool and you're not evaluating it for any reason, then you would typically fall outside the scope of 812 as a non-clinical investigation. So an example of that would be using software to collect data for a drug study or surgical intervention, or maybe you have some investigational software that you're going to run some imaging on to help with some of your study aims, but you're not looking to evaluate how well the software works. Even if that software isn't FDA approved, it might fall outside of the scope of 812 requirements. That changes if you want to evaluate how effective the software is as a exploratory aim of your study. In that case, you're bringing your whole study into FDA regulation. So it's really important as you're designing studies to pay attention to, do I really need to do this? Is this sort of a necessary outcome, or is this a sort of want that I have that is going to complicate the review process for this and bring something that might have otherwise not fallen within FDA's purview into the FDA's purview. So just like with the drug regulations, the regard team has a nice flow chart for this, and we're going to follow a similar model for that as well. So we're going to look at, are you looking to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the device? If yes, are you INDE exempt? If not, is it non-significant risk or significant risk? And I'll outline that in a minute here. But again, the focus is sort of, am I evaluating? Is it exempt? If not, what do I need to do? What would be the way to classify this? So ID exemptions, there are a handful of them, but there are two that I'm going to focus on in this presentation. The first is devices used within their indications approved in labeling. And so there's the regulatory citations there. So if you're evaluating a device through its approved or clear use, you are IDE exempt, and you do not need to jump through any particular hoops related to your FDA submission. Again, you need IRB approval, and you need to indicate what FDA regulations apply, but there aren't sort of additional regulations that apply to you outside of basic consent and IRB requirements. But really, this approved cleared use is complicated. It is less straightforward than it seems. It really depends on the intended use and the indications for use. And the indications for use are the specific populations, conditions, or situation where the device is supposed to be used or approved to be used. Where the indications that you're using it for may affect safety or effectiveness, then the FDA would consider that a new intended use, and that makes it more likely that your use is off-label and would not qualify for this exemption. And what makes this even harder to evaluate in most cases is that certain devices like ultrasound machines are approved for very broad uses by the FDA, but the FDA then says, well, if you're using it for a more specific indication, then that may be off-label. So it is important to pay attention to what you're doing, to not just assume that, hey, I'm using an ultrasound machine, so I should be, and ultrasound machines are broadly approved for all sorts of things. My use on this is going to be within the labeling. You really do have to look at what the indications are. You really have to look at how you're using it to make that determination. And I'm happy to help with those determinations as well. And you're going to need to support that, particularly if it's not entirely clear. You're not just using ultrasound as part of other aims. It's something that you're gonna have to pay particular attention to. And the FDA doesn't have a lot of great guidance on this available as well. The best we can do is in their changes in indication guidance that's really targeted towards 510(k) applications. I've linked that here, but you can see some of the examples of when they would say it's a new intended use. So something to consider, again, if you're gonna change the way that other clinicians use a device, that sort of suggests that more likely than not, it's going to be off-label. If it's not used in that way currently, it may be considered off-label. If a device company is giving you money to test their device in a certain way, that might also be an indication that what you're doing is off-label, because the reason that they're probably giving you that money potentially is because they want to get some information from you to see if they should look to try and make that indication part of their labeling for the device. So just some things to keep in mind as you're going through and using a device that is otherwise broadly approved and trying to fit it within this approved use definition. One place that you can look to try and get more information about your device is the FDA's device product classification database. So you can sort of go in here. There's a quick search that I would recommend over in the corner there. You using just to say, hey, I'm using a scalpel, right? You can put in scalpel. You can find examples of that, or laser, or any number of words to help you get an idea of what the indication for your device is. If it's a more complicated device, the FDA has the 510(k) lookup. You can also look up PMAs, although PMAs would typically sort of lean towards needing an IDE, depending on how you're using the device. But this will give you should be able to find both the indications of the device and likely the product labeling through this as well, so that you can make that determination. Jumping to the other big ID exemption, it's exempt diagnostic devices. Again, the regulatory citation is there. So this applies to devices that are non-invasive, do not require invasive sampling, do not introduce energy of any kind, and are not used for clinical decisions without confirmation by a medically established method. More often than not, we think about these in terms of in vitro diagnostic devices, so assays, tests, particularly when you're not releasing the results of that testing. But it isn't limited to that. So things like ECGs, which are passive signal collection devices, would also qualify as an exempt diagnostic device, as would software as a medical device if you're taking clinically obtained images to run through that software, then you're not introducing energy as part of the study. So you would likely qualify for the exempt diagnostic device category. On the other side, if you have some software that you've developed, you're going to run someone through a scan in order to test that device. You're more likely to fall within the scope. You're more likely not to fall within the scope of the exempt diagnostic device exemption because of the fact that you are introducing energy in order to evaluate your software. So something to keep in mind as well, it's not just the software in this case, it'd be any procedures that are used, such as sampling techniques in order to evaluate the final product. All right, so those were the IND exemptions. We talked about it. You're doing a study. You've realized you have a novel device, so you can't be approved. It's not an approved use of an approved device under approved labeling, and it's not ID exempt as an exempt diagnostic device. What happens now? Really, it comes down to whether or not the device is considered significant risk or non-significant risk. And I've laid out the criteria from the regulations for what's significant risk here. It really turns on whether it presents a potential for serious risk to health. If it does, then it's a significant risk device and you need to submit an IDE. If it's not, then you can call it a non-significant risk device. And you are not required to submit an application to the FDA. You only need to go through the IRB to get approval to do that. Some things to consider in making significant risk and non-significant device determination is that it includes the risk of the device itself, but it also includes risks associated with how the device is used in the study. So again, if you require invasive sampling procedure to be performed in order to test the software or the IVD, then that's going to make it a significant risk device, even if the software or the assay itself is low risk. And that's, again, same with procedures associated with the use of the device. So some examples of that, so risks associated with how devices used in the study, TMS, so transmagnetic stimulation, generally considered pretty low risk. If you're including it in children, then that increases the risk. So that's not just the risk of the device itself, it's also the population involved, and that may tip the scales for it to be a significant risk device. Same with procedures. Like I said, if you're doing a lumbar puncture to test an assay, then you're going to be a significant risk device if the lumbar puncture is required, because the FDA considers those significant risk. And then the last thing to note is that the NSR determination is a sponsor responsibility. So if you're a principal investigator doing one of these studies, it is on you to make sure that you're jumping through the hoops that you need to jump through. I'm going to jump through this quick, but I'll just note that medical device assessments are on a continuum. So you sort of have to look at what's less risky, what's more risky. That's extremely useful if you're developing your own devices to make sure that you're hitting all that you're trying to minimize the risk of the device so you can make that non-significant risk determination. And that's another thing that you want to consider as well. If you're making your own devices, you should be doing risk assessments as you're developing it to make sure that you're documenting everything you need to do to make the case to the IRB or the FDA that this is a non-significant risk device. Again, as the developer of the device, as the manufacturer, it's your responsibility to manufacture it in a way that reduces the risks as much as possible whenever possible. So something to consider for those of you developing either hardware medical devices or software medical devices. All right, so that covers quickly applying FDA regulations to drugs and devices. So I just want to cover very briefly sponsor investigator responsibilities. So in short, a sponsor is the individual that initiates the clinical investigation. The investigator is the person that conducts the clinical investigation. A sponsor investigator is both. And I think it's important to highlight because in the FDA's mind, again, sponsor is the person that initiates the clinical study, not the person that funds it. So it's a little bit different there. So when we say sponsor, it's the person that's responsible for designing the study. Now, I just want to note, and I've just highlighted here, there are lots of responsibilities that apply to both sponsors and investigators in a study, and they are dependent on the specific 812 or 312 requirements that apply. There are links here to details about device studies. Similarly, similar things apply to the drug requirements. There are specific responsibilities laid out in 21 CFR 312 for investigators and separate requirements for sponsors. So if you have an IND, you're going to want to look through those because there are things like as an investigator, you're required to report significant adverse events to a sponsor within 24 hours. And as a sponsor, you're then required to report that to the FDA within a certain period of time. So those are specific things that you need to understand if you're doing a study under an IND, either as a sponsor or investigator. But in general, I've tried to distill out some key sponsor and investigator responsibilities. So in terms of key sponsor responsibilities, which I want to start with because everything sort of starts with the sponsor, and that's a good thing to keep in mind. You're responsible for protocol development. You need to make sure that you're developing a scientifically sound and ethically appropriate protocol. That is sort of the primary responsibility, and that's something that I'll get to in a minute, is really highlighted in the updates to ICHGCP E6 that came out recently. As a sponsor, you're also responsible for selecting the right investigators, for monitoring and overseeing that the investigators are doing what you expect them to do, for reporting information to the FDA, and then also for maintaining both records for your records, your internal documents, your communications with the FDA if needed, or the IRB, as well as making sure that the investigators are keeping their records as well. I think, again, just important to note, the sponsor is sort of responsible for oversight of everything, and that's where sponsor investigators will run into problems because they're not necessarily thinking about that in the protocol development process. Now, here's just as a note, there are all sorts of resources to help sponsors and investigators. So I've laid out a few of them here to help you navigate these responsibilities. So Central Monitoring Service can help you ensure adequate oversight of a study. I can help you submit INDs. The clinicaltrials.gov can help you meet reporting requirements, and RAPID, the research and development, our protocol development program within ICTR, can help you with designing a protocol. And you might have internal resources that can help with that as well. Now, how do sponsor requirements, how are they distinguished from, or sorry, how are investigator requirements distinguished from sponsor requirements? Well, really, the investigator is the person that's responsible for conducting the studies, so it's on them to make sure that they're adhering to the protocol. They also are the front lines for protecting rights, safety, and welfare of subjects, and that is something that will get you in trouble with the FDA if you're not doing. So paying attention to what's going on, monitoring your staff, oversight and delegation, that all plays into it. You also are responsible for controlling the product, and then reporting anything to the FDA. And so things like protocol adherence, like for a sponsor investigator, these straddle the line a little bit, but you need to make sure as a sponsor, it's your responsibility to submit a change before the site implements it. If you're the sponsor investigator, do both, right? You're responsible for both. You can't say, hey, it was the sponsor's responsibility when you're the one who is also the sponsor. So something to keep in mind. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today was sort of new things within the FDA. Admittedly, there isn't a lot of new things within the FDA right now. The federal government isn't putting out a lot of new guidance at this point in time, but one of the things that did come out in September was the FDA's finalization of ICH GCP E6 R3, good clinical practice. As noted here, you'll see really to distill down what's in the new ICH GCP E6. They're sort of looking to increase flexibility, modernize trials, data sources. They've really pushed quality by design. You do the best work at protecting subjects by having a well-designed protocol, and also risk-based quality management in the sense that use the tools that you have to ensure that you're maintaining
No, only if,
responsibility.
so just make sure those are right,
Oh,
that something is checked.
oh, there we go. Sorry. And then do some clarifications. But again, I just in terms of things for investigators, things for sponsors, quality by design, risk-based approaches, uh, you know, being able to factor in things like decentralized clinical trials. It's worth a review at some point in the near future. There will be an updated training through Citi that anyone working with sponsors will have to take sooner than later. So keep your eye out for emails on that, but also happy to answer any questions about sort of implementation of E6 moving forward. That's it. I went a little over what I was hoping, but I will open the floor for any questions. And if anyone has any questions later, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you, Jake. People can feel free to unmute or please put your question in chat. Maybe I can start with a question, Jake, about the future that you're seeing or hearing from FDA, as far as, what they'll be doing in the current climate.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of insight into where the FDA is going in terms of research. It's been a bit of a black hole. There have been some guidance documents that have been posted recently, but most of them are related to sort of manufacturing and marketing activities or submitting marketing applications. I can tell you from experience that if you're submitting an IND or an IDE, those things are slowing down quite a bit because there have been a lot of FDA staff that have left. We're also running into some problems with FDA inspectors because a lot of the inspectors that have been here for a while have also left recently. So things are a little wonky, and some of the inspectors have told us recently that, they're not impressed by this new group of investigators that are coming on. So I think that's something that we're, as a group, going to have to navigate. It may require providing some guidance and support to the FDA reviewers that are here. It's also just an understanding that there may be some pushback, and that we also can push back with the FDA. And that's something to consider. Like, respectful disagreement is something that the FDA finds completely acceptable. And we've had them ask some pretty crazy stuff. There was one IND that we submitted where they said, hey, this investigator is not a MD, so they can't be an investigator. That's actually not true. It's in the FDA's 1572 guidance that you don't need to be an MD to be a clinical investigator. You just have to have the medical expertise. So we get to quote back the FDA's own guidance to them. So those are like the weird things that we're seeing right now. And I sort of expect we'll see that in the future as some of this goes on, continues to go on. But I'm hoping, eventually they start sending out some more guidance because that is super useful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Mihaela?
Yes, thank you for this information, Jake, and so good to see you and reconnect. My question relates, and I don't know if this falls under your, purview, but the push from the NIH to limit animal research and emphasize more clinical approaches. Now, how would that work? Along the phases of drug development. So, because in early phases, you have to have preclinical safety, isn't it? So how would that work in this translation continuum?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And I think that's something that we're going to have to sort of figure out as we go. I don't think that the federal government has fully realized what the ramifications of that are yet. But for anyone, so this is what I would say. For anyone that's looking to develop a new product that requires animal modeling, one of the things that we would do if it's a device or if it's a drug is submit a pre-IND meeting with the FDA and say, hey, we have this product that we want to develop. Here's what we're planning for our preclinical development. Can we get some input on it, particularly as it relates to animal modeling requirements? Because those are questions that we've asked the FDA in the past, like how can we, what sort of animal modeling we need. So I think that would be the approach that I would recommend. But I think it's sort of still early on in the process to understand how this is going to impact. I imagine industry is going to have some thoughts on this and may put out some sort of some information will filter out from industry that might help provide some direction here. But I think these are the type of questions. I don't know the answer. There isn't good guidance. I think we just have to go directly to the source and say, FDA, how are we going to deal with this? So more to come, and I'm happy to sort of send out more information on that if it becomes available. But we just have to play it by ear at the moment.
Right, thank you. Other questions? People a minute here to think of anything. Make sure I'm not missing any. Teresa, are you seeing any?
No, I'm not.
All right, sounds good. Well, Jake, thank you very much again for your insights today and for giving us a talk. Let's see what the future holds. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.